In this section, what we're going to do is take a quick look at replicated case designs. And I would say that today, replicated case designs are the preferred approach to case research. And if you want to get published in an academic journal, it's going to be much easier to get a replicated design published than a single case design. So in this brief presentation, we'll begin by looking at some of the objectives of replicated designs. Then what we will do is just briefly summarize the notion of experimental versus sampling logic and some of the alternative designs that you might consider when you're doing a replicated design approach. Then we'll take a look at two examples that I wrote. The first is high-tech Hidebound, and then the second is a course complexity, which includes a longitudinal study as one of its replications. So what are we trying to achieve when we do replication research? Well, one of the things that we may be trying to do is to develop conceptual schemes. And I tend to use conceptual schemes as opposed to the term theory when I'm talking about case development. But what I'm basically talking about is creating resonant frameworks that can be used to explain or predict behaviors with the assumption that they might be useful. Again, I'm a believer in high extrinsic complexity, and in a high extrinsic complexity world, what we assume is anything we discover in one context might be usable in another context, but we would not necessarily project that it will be. And that means that the user of these frameworks has to think a lot about what conceptual scheme is a good fit. Translate into research terms, you could have a lot of theories, and it's up to the user to figure out which theory to apply. Another thing that we can do is we can try to establish boundaries for our theories or conceptual schemes. In particular, we can try to identify situations that are outside the domain of a particular theory, or demonstrate that a particular theory may be applicable in domains beyond the one where it was originally discovered. Finally, replication research promotes comparison. One of the challenges you always have in deciding what analysis to do is the fact that you don't necessarily have benchmarks. I talked about this in the single case version. And in that case, you depend upon theory, or maybe the comparison of theory, to give you things to compare and therefore analyze. When you have a replicated case design, you have the ability to compare the cases with each other, and that allows you to focus your analysis on that comparison, and that can add a lot more meat to the study that you're trying to publish. When we're looking at multiple cases, what we're usually trying to decide between is two cases from a similar context or from a different context, and cases which have similar outcomes or different outcomes. And we could potentially have replications in any of these quadrants. Obviously, quadrants is an oversimplification because contexts are similar, not identical, but it gives you the general idea in terms of what we're looking for. So if we do the similar context and come up with similar outcomes, then what we've done is we've replicated the findings of the first case with the second case. Given that business research really doesn't replicate that often, that's probably a useful finding, though not necessarily a very exciting one. Now, another case we could have is where we get a similar outcome in a very different context. That suggests that our research might be relatively generalizable. since it is not heavily dependent upon the original context. Another possibility is where you have research in a similar context which produces a different outcome. What that suggests is that your research is very fragile or brittle, so you cannot really count on it generalizing. Finally, we have the situation where you have a different outcome and a different content, and honestly, that tells us very little. So if we take a look at these different designs, what I would argue is that two of them in particular represent a kind of a sweet spot. The similar outcome, different context involves generalizability. It suggests, hey, this result may be very generalizable, and similar context, different outcome basically suggests that the theory is rather brittle. The replication of findings is nice, and as I say, different outcomes, different context tells us little. So most of the designs that I talk about involve these elements. Sometimes they'll also include one of these if you want to have three cases. So the first case we're going to talk about is the high-tech Hidebound case research. And this particular article was inspired by two discussion cases that I often taught back-to-back in my executive MBA class. And what I found was that although these discussion cases came from very, very different industries, one was from financial services, one was a cookie maker, Mrs. Fields Cookies, the outcomes were very similar. I'll allow you to think about where that fits on the grid. It will doubtless appear on the quiz. Now, a third replication was added, the Microsoft Developer Network, and it was added at the request of a reviewer. And it was designed to show potential limits to the generalizability of what we saw in the first two cases. The case employs complexity theory in a different way from the other cases. In this particular case, I'm dealing with complex systems theory, and what complex systems theory tends to suggest is that systems often exhibit relatively predictable behavior, a kind of an equilibrium for a while, and then experience sudden shocks. And so one of the things that I was interested in is what happens when the behavior in the environment changes and how firms are effective. And what you'll find as you read about Battery March and MFC is both of them employed very unique organizational structures for their time, which was the early 1980s. And I think basically what I was interested in is the outcomes. Obviously, in these cases, since I had discussion cases, I did not have the outcomes. So what I needed to do was actually go to the literature and the popular press to find out what happened to these companies. The article is somewhat shorter than some of the other articles, but again, I recommend that you use the quiz and then try to find things in the research using the quiz. Again, this is a very good habit to get into because when you start using the literature for your research, you will often find it much, much more effective to go into articles looking for something specifically that you want as opposed to trying to read the entire article cover to cover. When an article is very, very interesting, yes, you can read it cover to cover, or if it's covering a research method exactly like one that you want to mimic, yeah, by all means, study every word. But for the most part, I recommend going after articles in a very opportunistic way, looking at them to try to find out what it is that you're looking for and not get distracted by the details that you don't care about. The course complexity case essentially involves three different replications and was developed from classroom experience. And I think it employs a very interesting research design, and I hope that when you read the case, you will focus on the design and once again not get too tied up in the details. It looks at two different classes that are taught by two different instructors, and the combinations that were looked at were very specifically designed to provide insights into the underlying theory, which happens to be that educational settings exist on a rugged landscape. So, as you may recall, when I talked about complexity in the previous module, what I did was I talked about some of the expected impacts of high extrinsic complexity on outcomes. Now, at the time, I wasn't calling it an extrinsic complexity, but you'll get the general idea. And what I was trying to do is use the way these courses were designed as a tool for demonstrating the fact that you really could not view the educational setting as consisting of a set of decomposable attributes. It's really the combination that determines whether a class is successful or not. The replication logic, I think, is rather interesting, and I think there's a diagram which sort of captures it, and certainly that will be topics that are covered on the quiz. Triangulation is employed in many different ways, and you can also expect to be asked about that. So as you look through the case, look at all the different sources of data that were gathered in order to assess what was happening and try to make an assessment of the success or failure of the courses. Again, it's a long case, and so what you really want to do is focus in on specific elements. And as I say, you can use the quiz to guide you. That's definitely not cheating.